Richard McPherson, you're back.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for coming back, sir. This is episode number 2, episode number 1 of American Nuclear Series that we did last week. Huge hit. I mean, I got calls and emails and texts from people. Really enjoyed it. So just first off, thank you for coming back and committing to this. Today, it sounds like you want to talk about basics of fission, right? Which is essentially the process that is going on in all nuclear reactors, which is, hey, look, we're firing neutrons.
All fission reactors.
All fission reactors, excuse me. We're firing a neutron. We get out of that heat and some other stuff. That's how we, it's the same as burning coal, burning wood. It's like we get heat and we exchange a process for heat. Some other stuff happens in all of the different processes, but that's at the core of nuclear fission.
That's correct.
Great.
It's as simple as that.
Take me from the beginning.
Okay. So what are we going to see this?
Yeah. I'll pop these up on the screen. So this guy to start.
Okay. So let me have this.
Great.
Well, no, you can.
No. I have it on my phone. You can.
Okay. So what this is, I got this from the Department of Energy, I think. Yeah, Department of Energy. Okay. So let's compare our primary energy sources that we use in the world. We use oil, we use coal, we use natural gas, and we use uranium. Yes, we have hydro. Yes, we have wind. Yes, we have solar. Yes, we have geothermal. But these are the principal ones that the world economies and the people live on.
And if I may ask, when we talk about fuel, hydro doesn't involve a fuel source, right? Wind doesn't involve a fuel source.
No.
Right. When we're talking about fuel, we're talking about something that we harvest.
The wind does have a fuel source. It's the sun. Because the sun helps to cause the winds blow around the earth.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's the argument. Solar, obviously, then the fuel source would be
solar is a conversion that we have. These solar panels that are made,
right.
And it's conversion from the sun.
Right.
And hydro is simply the water going over the dam or through the dam, driving a turbine,
sure,
which drives a generator.
Got it. Okay, cool. So keep going.
Okay, so in this particular case, we have for pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors, which is the majority of the reactors in the world. I'm talking about commercial reactors now. I'm not talking about Navy reactors. They use some fuel pellets, and the fuel pellets are encased in a tube. And a bunch of these tubes are put together into what's called a fuel bundle. And that's the uranium that undergoes fission, creates the heat, transfers it through those tubes, and heats water that's going through there. But a uranium pellet is about the size of the end of your little finger. It's about the size, a little bit larger than an eraser on a pencil. Its equivalent is, if we have coal, it's the equivalent of a ton of coal. It's the equivalent of 120 gallons of oil or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. So there's a lot of energy in that uranium. And we call it energy density. All of those we call energy density.
Okay, so literally if you have the pellet, again, a little bit larger than the size of an eraser on a pencil, and say you somehow converted that into a car, right? And say my car gas tank holds 12 gallons. You would have to, from that little eraser, you would have to refill my gas tank 10 times, literally 120 gallons of gasoline that, like, however far you can drive, it's like, yeah, and that little pellet would produce that kind of energy.
Roughly, because it's an equivalent of oil, which is then turned into gasoline.
Sure, okay.
So it's the same thing.
Different. Yeah.
So the one little pellet is the equivalent, just like you say, of refueling your car about 20 times.
So if you could do 30 miles per gallon, okay, and let's say it's 120 gallons of gasoline, I know it's not a perfect conversion, then you're looking at, what is that, 3,600 miles you could drive at 30 miles per gallon in one eraser head.
That's correct.
There's a lot of energy density.
It is a lot of energy density. It's It's the highest energy density that we found so far. It was first found in the early 1900s. The first time it was fissioned was under a set of bleachers at the University of Chicago. That project was immediately turned into the Manhattan Project, where we first made 2 nuclear reactors to produce fuel for nuclear weapons. But look at that one pellet compared to oil trucks going down the road, cars of coal going down on a railroad, or a natural gas pipeline pumping natural gas all over the country. It is the most useful source of energy that we have. It's the cleanest source of energy that we have. It's the safest form of energy we have. So that's why uranium is so important. The problem is we don't have a lot of uranium. We're using maybe 68,000 metric tons worldwide annually. The United States by far does not hold the most uranium. The majority of the uranium in the world is held by Australia. I think Canada runs it second. We're down around number 5 or 6. Russia has a lot of uranium. China doesn't have much uranium. In another episode, we'll talk about Southeast Asia and China and all that and their energy requirements.
If I may ask, where in the United States can we get uranium?
The majority of the uranium in the United States is in New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Other states, including Idaho, has some uranium. There is a lot more uranium that we haven't found. There's something called the U.S. Geodetic Survey. It's been around since the 1800s.
Okay.
And they keep track of mining and minerals. Uranium hasn't been very important to our government for commercial nuclear power, which has always been surprising to me. When I went to the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1989, I had access to everything. So that means I had access to everything that they had compiled from 1954 to 1989. So I don't know why, but I wrote a paper on uranium. It just interested me because I had never seen or read the full truth about uranium. So I decided to put it on paper. I did. Once I got it on paper, I realized this was not something that I should be transmitting through the United Nations system. So I flew back to Washington, D.C., and I gave a copy of my paper to my direct report at the State Department and to the Secretary of Energy, who at the time was retired Admiral by the name of James D. Watkins. He said, "Give me a call tomorrow. I want to read this overnight." Next day, I called him and he said, "We don't have some of this information." It took a few days for it to cycle through from my primary report over State Department. I get a call from somebody and said, "We'd like to talk to you about this paper." Turns out other people didn't have all that information either. And what I identified was the truth about what was going on with uranium around the world. And already in early 1989, in my opinion, where the United States was already way behind in the overall fuel cycle, the front end of the fuel cycle, of mining uranium, milling uranium, and having the capability of turning it into enriched fuel to use for reactors. Well, that's turned out to be really true. So that's why I did that paper. The next one I'd like to talk to you about is the nuclear fuel cycle.
Got it. I got it right here.
So the nuclear fuel cycle, it's got a front end and a back end. The front end is where we start with, we've got to go out and find the uranium. Then we've got to mine it. Then we mill it into something called yellow cake. Then we turn it into another form, which is a gas. And then we turn it into another form, which is enriched uranium, which we then use in uranium fuel for reactors.
Okay, so you go from mining to milling to yellow cake, turn the yellow cake into a gas, and then condense the gas back into physical form,
Yes.
and then you turn it into enriched uranium.
Then we enrich it. And we enrich it for commercial purposes up to 20%.
I've always heard enriched uranium. I do not know what you're saying to me. So when you
Okay,
say
what it means
I
is-
enrich it, are you adding neutrons to it? Like, what are you doing to it?
It in the most simplest form, it turns out to be the ratio of uranium-235 to natural uranium, which is 238.
Okay.
When you mine uranium-238, there are about 5 other uranium isotopes in there. One of them is uranium-235. Uranium-235 only makes up 0.72% of natural uranium.
Okay. So if I have 100 pounds of natural uranium, I'm going to have
7.2
less than a
pounds.
pound
Seven-
of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a tiny portion. So first off, I got to find 100 pounds of natural uranium. I have to mine it successfully, and then out of all of that, I'm going to have like
0.72%.
right, like 10 ounces,
Not
11
much,
ounces.
not much.
Sure. Okay.
So, and that's the value. That's the uranium that's so valuable, because that's what we built our thermal reactors around, is the use of uranium-235, and we've been very successful at it.
So in the enrichment process, you're essentially separating out the useless 99.3% of the 238 isotope.
Well, you separate it out ahead of time,
Gotcha. Okay.
and then what you do is during the enrichment process, you take uranium-238 that you've now made into a pure uranium, and then you enrich it using uranium-235. And commercially, we could go to close to 20%. Now, it's public knowledge, which it wasn't forever, that Navy reactors use 94% enriched fuel. But you get above 20%, and the reason that limit is set there is because when they created the non-proliferation treaty, non-proliferation meaning you sign a treaty that you won't make nuclear weapons. So in order to get fuel that's enriched enough to use in a nuclear weapon, you have to enrich it above 20%.
So that's where the 20% threshold.
So that's where the 20% threshold came about.
So again, please excuse my ignorance. I just really want to be clear on this. So you take a lot of uranium that you mine, right? And you turn to yellow cake, gas, the whole thing.
Right.
You get that all separated out. And then the enrichment process is, okay, we have 238. And when we enrich it, that means we're literally adding in this very rare portion isotope, that uranium-235. We're going to add that to it. So then we get a final product that's, let's say, 80% 238 uranium-238, and then 20% uranium-235.
In the simplest terms, that's what we do.
Great. And that is a combination that does not exist in nature, because the 235 really is, in mass, is going to be less than 1% of a hunk of uranium. So that's why it's like very enriched. And then when you go to the nuclear stuff, or excuse me, like military stuff, you're going like it's almost pure 235 uranium.
When we naval reactors, which makes reactors for submarines, surface ships, which includes aircraft carriers, we're allowed to use we have 94% enrichment. That's why one of the reasons why the cores last so long.
Because the 235 is really the thing undergoing fission. So if you have a 20% 235 and 80% 238 uranium fuel source, it's only the 20% of the 235 that's actually going to be undergoing fission and expelling heat that we need. And that's so that you have the 94% enrichment for things that are, military grade. And that's like, 4 times or 5 times the fuel source. It's like, all right, man, this bad boy is going to last a long time because we have so much uranium.
Also, we can make a much smaller reactor.
Gotcha. Because if you need a certain quantity of the 235, you don't have to have all of this mass of the 238 along with it. It's like, no. Just get us the stuff we need and throw in 6% of 238.
That's correct.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
So in gross terms, that's the simplest explanation. So that's the front end of the fuel cycle. And the front end of the fuel cycle is complex. But it's very mature. And they started underneath these bleachers in the University of Chicago. And then we made 2 reactors during World War II. And then we made in 1950 the EBR-1, which is experimental breeder reactor number 1, which you could go visit and walk through up at the INL. And then in March of 1953, the first U.S. Navy reactor, pressurized water reactor, came about. So that's pretty much the front end of the fuel cycle. Right now, the United States lacks enrichment capability. We also lack mining. So we're not doing the amount of mining we need to do in this country for the power plants that we have. We're not doing the enrichment in this country for the plants we have because it's been an economical issue. And we've been able to receive fuel from Kazakhstan and Russia at a much cheaper price than we can make it here.
But it also has an inherent cost of reliance on Kazakhstan and Russia.
It lulled us into a sense of complacency, which is now caught up with us. And Russia's been very clever about that. Now, one of the things that I found in writing my paper at the International Atomic Energy Agency was there were 105 member nations when I got there. Each member nation has its own office. Of the 105 member nations, only about 30 of them have some sort of a nuclear program. From one country, which the United States is very close to, one of the people there was kind enough to take me aside and tell me what the Soviet Union was trying to do about uranium. So I had already started writing my report when I was told that Russia is trying to control the world's uranium supply, and had even been to them and tried to get them enter into an agreement whereby fuel would not be sold. It would only be leased because Russia knew the value in recycling the fuel.
Which ties into something we touched on in the first episode, which is Russia understood that it was going to be very bad for them if the United States was able to successfully continue researching and producing nuclear energy. So they have this social push in America that's been going on for decades, the anti-nuclear movement, essentially activists for hire is what it's morphed into.
That's what it's morphed into, that's correct.
So they have this social push, but then they also bring a technical push, which is, hey, let's be the only people that have this thing. So if social, quote, diplomatic, peaceful things fail, they won't be able to do it because we'll be the only one that can mill, and produce this stuff.
They wanted to control the world's uranium supply. So I actually got into that a lot more with the people that were there. And it was common knowledge, but it wasn't talked about. Well, it certainly was not common knowledge back in Washington, D.C., to the level of detail that I gave them. Well, now we've seen since then a number of things happen. We saw during one of our administrations in the last decade or so, we sold a bunch of our uranium supply to Russia.
In the last decade?
Yes. So they now, it's in the ground. Russia was able to buy a company that owns a bunch of uranium reserves in the United States.
Representative Ted Hill, who I know you know, has been so vocal about our continued action to sell off assets to foreign countries, adversarial or otherwise, right? Like the water company in Eagle, Idaho is owned by the French, right? Syngenta, which is a seed company that owns our strategic seed supply, is owned by the Chinese government, right? And he's obviously trying to pass a bill for critical infrastructure, for land around critical infrastructure. There have been many cases all throughout the United States where the Chinese government has acquired farmland and other land in close proximity to military installations, like top secret places that they then find, monitoring devices on and things like that. And this plays exactly into what he's talking about, which is not only do they have control of the fuel sources, but then they buy essentially companies who have the rights or leases to existing reserves.
Right. Now, so it doesn't make any sense at all for a communist country or a jihadist-controlled country to own any real estate in America. So you got to ask yourself, who is authorizing them to do it? Because in some of these cases, such as Surgena, they were authorized to make the purchase of that company, the Chinese Communist Party. Same way with a bunch of the land that's been purchased, or the largest pork producer in the United States is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. That was signed off by the United States, people in the United States government. Why would they do that? Let's just stick to communism for a moment. The Communist Party USA was formed in November of 1919. How have they been allowed to operate? Being a subversive organization trying to take over America, how have they been allowed to operate for over 100 years?
This is a really interesting question, right? And I think there should likely be a distinction between allowed to operate, allowed to exist, and allowed to successful at influencing policy, right? So say I have some wackadoo idea, and you're like, Matt's a wackadoo. His ideas are not good for America. Okay, well, guess the best part about America is I get to have whatever wackadoo idea I want.
Right.
Okay. Then can I attempt to influence policy? Well, should you stop me from writing emails or no, I mean, theoretically, I got a wackadoo idea, but I also have freedom of speech and I get to do these things. The check that is supposed to exist is that we have a representative government that is educated enough that looks at Matt's wackadoo idea and is like, listen, man, I represent a lot of people. And for those people, that's a wackadoo idea. And that is not good for them. So you can think whatever you want. You can write me whatever emails you want. You can protest however you want, signs, whatever it is. But I'm not going along with that because it's bad for America. So I can attempt to influence policy. I can exist in my idea form and, organize however I like, freedom of assembly, wonderful. But it shouldn't actually work to affect policy.
No, and especially when it's not just buying things, but it's also the spies that are here that go to work for various companies, including universities, including the government, that steal our technology. They've been doing that now for 100 years or so. Why are we allowing them to do that? That doesn't make any sense at all. It didn't make any sense to a whole bunch of us when it was commonly called Uranium 1, that the Russians were allowed to buy some of our uranium reserves right here in the United States. Uranium is so valuable, depending on who you talk to. If you go to the USGS and some of those people, they'll tell you that we have 85 years of uranium left at the rate at which we're expected to use it. If you go to the Japanese, and specifically this came from the president of Toshiba in 2010, in a meeting I was in with him, they had calculated that if we go to breeder reactors, which President Carter outlawed breeder reactors, saying if we don't breed fuel, then nuclear weapons won't proliferate. Nothing could be further from the truth. So if we go to breeder reactors, the Japanese calculations are, we have enough fissionable fuel in the world to last 3,000 years. Well, the difference between what some people in the federal government say, we've got 85 years worth of uranium left, and 3,000 years is a big difference. The difference being going to breeder reactors. So we do need to go to breeder reactors, but we also need to safeguard and cherish the uranium we have.
Are breeder reactors still illegal in the country?
We are starting to use breeder reactors again, and it's a subject of controversy, and it still has not been settled in the Congress about breeder reactors. But we need breeder reactors. We need it both from the standpoint of making more fissionable fuel out of uranium, and then also converting thorium into uranium to make it a fissionable fuel.
How much thorium do we have?
Why do you ask me these hard questions?
Well, you're just talking. Yeah, you're getting me all freaked out about limited uranium sources. Then you're like, hey, man, but we could also make it out of thorium. It's like, that's good. That's good to know.
So I don't have a good feeling for the amount of thorium in the United States.
But that is an alternative,
But
however
compared to uranium, I think in the Earth's crust, we probably have somewhere around 5 times more or 6 times more thorium in the Earth's crust than we do uranium. But keep in mind that we have to use some of that uranium to be able to convert thorium into a useful fuel.
Do the Russians own the thorium too?
They have some thorium also. Thorium's found all over the world.
Okay, so that's not
just
as
like
rare.
uranium's found all over the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Continue. I'm sorry. I know we're going down different
That's
rabbit
okay.
holes here.
No. Each one of these is good to build on.
So bottom line is Russia had essentially has had a steady campaign to own the supplies or the rights to the uranium throughout the world, including the United States.
That's correct.
Got it.
But we have also, because our commercial reactors can buy fuel wherever at the most economical price, Kazakhstan has priced it. Russia has priced it. So it's more economical for our commercial fleet of reactors to buy from them than it is the United States. But one of the reasons is the United States government is way behind in making sure that we have a good front end of the uranium cycle, front end as we call it commonly, because we don't have the mining we should have. We don't have the conversion processes we should have, and we certainly do not have the enrichment capabilities we should have. And that's something that I identified was on the horizon in 1989.
If I were to kind of make a ridiculous, dude, I got a Blackstone barbecue last night. I fired it up. It was fantastic. I made like 4 or 5 pounds of burgers. I don't know if you're a smash burger fan, but like the Blackstone's essentially like a giant skillet, right? And
I'm living proof that you cannot live on cheeseburgers alone your whole life.
Okay. Well, maybe just have one more then. Come over to my house for dinner. But essentially what the analogy would be, okay, so say I don't have a kitchen. I don't have a stove. I don't have a barbecue. I don't have a pan. I ain't got a spatula. Okay. I got nothing. I have a little money, right? And it's like, all right, so I suppose I could buy a stove or buy a barbecue, get a propane tank, all of these things, or I just go to In-N-Out and I get a burger for $2. And I'm like, I'm not going to invest the thousands of dollars to get the end product of one burger when I could just go to In-N-Out and buy a burger for $2. So instead of investing in this front end of like, hey, I have all the things to make burgers now. So I could actually make burgers for cheaper than $2 a burger if I just invested in this stuff. But instead of that, I'm like, nah, I'm just going to get my entire burger supply from In-N-Out.
That is a great analogy. It is a perfect
and
analogy.
now we're hooked on Russia for In-N-Out burgers.
That's right. And we had capabilities in the United States, but because they came under the auspices of the Department of Energy, people that were in charge of the Department of Energy did not take care to prepare this country for the future. The Department of Energy has only been around since 1977. Prior to the Department of Energy, it was the Atomic Energy Commission. And in 1974, because of pressure from the anti-nuclear industry, Congress decided to split up the Atomic Energy Commission into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and something called ERDA, Energy Research and Development Agency, or something like that. And 3 years later, it became the Department of Energy. Now, one of the first secretaries of energy, from the standpoint of policy and how you should run an organization, tried to do a good job. And I've watched it the whole time. So from 1977, I've had the opportunity to watch the Department of Energy. In my opinion, after him, we've only had one real Secretary of Energy, and that was a former Chief of Naval Operations by the name of James D. Watkins, who retired as a 4-star admiral, and President Reagan put him in charge of the Department of Energy. And he started to get his hands around the Department of Energy to make it go to work the way it should, only to have the Clintons be elected in 1993, and they put Hazel O'Leary over there, and she promptly threw away everything that Admiral Watkins has done, and since then we haven't had a true Secretary of Energy. Now, the person we have now, we still have to see what he does. He has got experience in oil and gas. He was on the board of directors of one of the startup nuclear companies. He talks well, but we haven't seen what he says in translating what President Trump wants in the way of a good economy and independent energy. We haven't seen what the Secretary of Energy has said over the past 6 months translate down to the lower levels of the Department of Energy and speed up the process of getting new reactors. So we still have to wait and see what happens.
Gotcha. One small side note, that the playbook of getting somebody hooked on cheap energy so you can control it, this is something that Russia in particular is doing in a contemporary manner with its gas pipeline to Europe, right? Like they're supplying natural gas to, say, Germany and whatnot. And in the last several years, we've seen the cost of energy in Germany skyrocket. I had a friend who actually, he spent some time in Germany as a teenager, really enjoyed it, speaks German fluently, which is hilarious. And it's like super cool guy. He, in the beginning of 2020, like January, is like, I think what we're going to do is, he had 2 teenagers, like, we're going to go over there. We're going to move to Germany. His wife speaks German as well. We're going to move to Germany. They were actually able to keep their jobs. He was essentially just working in off hours, but he was self-employed. And he was like, my kids are going to get these international baccalaureates. They're going to be fluent in German. It's going to be this great experience. He moves over there March of 2020, and they promptly get locked down in their apartment, and his kids learn no German because they're not going outside. They're trapped trying to do like virtual classroom stuff. Anyway, train wreck. But he was over there. He was like, the energy crisis here is so substantial. People are literally going out into the local, just wildlands areas and scraping off, dead wood from that. He was like, the entire thing got essentially like swept. He was like, you could eat off of the floor in the local, like, wild areas, like forest, wooded areas, because they had no energy. And people were like, here it was winter. And they're like, no, dude, they're burning everything here.
Keep in mind, Russia is a communist country run by a communist dictator. So they use everything available to them strategically to get their way. And cutting off the natural gas supply to Western Europe is part of it.
But it only matters to cut it off if you get them hooked on it in the first place.
Well,
cutting something off that you didn't care about is, like, you cut off my tequila supply, irrelevant to me. Because I'm not chugging down Patron with any regularity in any kind of annual cycle, right? But if it's a daily or weekly thing and you stop it, then I really care. The first step is getting me to enjoy it.
Natural gas, 100 years ago, natural gas was a waste stream from the drilling and bringing to the surface crude oil. It was a waste stream. So I tell people to go study the evolution of natural gas. It is a great thing to study because you can see how something that started out as a waste stream has become a very useful energy product. We have probably close to 300,000 miles of natural gas pipelines in the United States. Maybe around 40% of our electricity comes from natural gas. So it's gone from a waste to something that's very usable. And unfortunately, in some of the oil fields around the world, including the United States, we still flare off natural gas because they don't simply have a pipeline to put it into. Or in the case of the North Slope of Alaska, when the late 1960s, we were talking about putting a crude oil pipeline in from North Slope down to the southern part of Alaska, people talked about, especially the governor at the time, or Wally Hickel at the time, said we need to put in a natural gas pipeline at the same time. Well, the anti-everybody's, the anti-nuclear people, were now anti-oil and anti-natural gas. So they referred to it as Hickel's folly. So the natural gas pipeline never got put in. So once we started producing crude oil and putting it down the 800-mile pipeline, the natural gas, which should have been used, it reverted back to what it was found to be originally, a waste stream. So what did they have to do on the North Slope of Alaska? They have to re-inject it back down in the ground. So since 1970 to today, and it continues, we re-inject that natural gas back down into the ground, of which some of it's lost forever, at a great cost. That becomes part of the cost of operations of the crude oil that comes out of the North Slope of Alaska that we get into tankers and we send to refineries. So the cost of crude oil out of Alaska, part of the cost is the cost burden from having to deal with that natural gas and pump it back down the ground.
We're literally harvesting. I had no idea. I don't even know what to say about that. That is absolutely wild.
It's among the many stupid things that we have done because of activists that get their way. Well-funded activists.
Look, you and I both spent a lot of time in the state that shall not be named. You weren't born there. I was born there.
I was born here in a naval hospital in 1944.
Oh, gotcha. And you hung out in Hawaii for a bit. You've been a lot of places.
Yes.
Okay. When I moved to Idaho, and God bless every second of it, I met conservationists that were real people, right? Like the first one
No. They were actual conservationists.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at. And I met people that were highly educated, that loved the outdoors, wanted to utilize the outdoors for recreation, for hunting, for fishing. And because of that, they're like, look, man, I love fishing. I want fish to continue being here. I'm not trying to get people to stop fishing. I love hunting. I want enough hunting to be here. I don't want people to stop hunting. And they had engaged in these pragmatic, long-term campaigns to make sure there were enough fish for everyone, to make sure that there were enough elk and mule deer and all these different things, right? And it blew me away. The first guy I met was Brian Brooks. He was the executive director for Idaho Wildlife Federation at the time, and now he works for the National Avian Conservancy or something of that nature. But incredible guy. And I was like, wow, these are what real conservationists are. That's wild. And they're not just tying themselves to tree trunks. They're not, this was wild. The UC Berkeley decides to redo their football stadium. Whether or not you think it's a good idea, fine. They spent like $500 million. As they're increasing tuition, increasing class sizes, they also spend $500 million on a new football stadium. Be that as it may, they have to cut down some California oaks. Gasp. Pearl clutching. You have to cut down the California oaks. California oaks, very beautiful, nice, and it's California oak, fine. And the activists in the area lose their minds. And they don't hug the trees. They climb up and live in the trees. There were people living in these California oaks for months, which is wild because you're like, where did they go to the bathroom? Right? How do they get food? So there's obviously like some manner of supporting industry around these people living in the trees. There was a poli-sci professor there, Jack Citron. Jack Citron did not care at all. And he came up with a contest that was, hey, whoever can think of the best way to get the tree people out of the trees, I will take you to the faculty dining club and you'll get to have lunch with me. And so everybody, was like this contest. So people writing up these papers and, do this or say that, or, play loud music, play Baby Shark, like as loud as you. And the winner of the contest said, this is what you do. You get them done in an afternoon. You take one endangered species per hour and execute it at the base of the tree. It's just like take a snow owl and just. It's like in 4 hours of seeing these poor animals get executed, they'll come out of the trees. I got to go to the faculty club and have lunch with them. But again, like that was the type of conservationist that I understood to exist. And again, I think that's absolutely more of just a function of the paid insanity that you're talking about, which is let's grind practical solutions to a halt. Let's grind the conversation to a halt. Let's be anti-human, not pro-utility, which is, hey, we want fish that we can fish. We want elk we can hunt. No. We don't want any humans touching this. We don't want any, and that I saw that perpetuated, and that's why you have that state in such a horrendous state of existence.
And I watched that start in the early 1970s. So I came back to Hawaii I came back to California from submarines out of Hawaii in early 1972. So now I'm in San Diego, California, and I'm also got custody of my son, who's 6 years old. My dad's and my brother are north. Dad started taking us up into the southern end of the Sierras when he was stationed out in the middle of Mojave Desert at China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station in 1950. So we've been going in the southern end of the Sierras ever since. So every summer, in August generally, I would take leave for a couple of weeks and we'd go in the southern end of the Sierras. So there's a big fire, huge fire. And every summer we'd go back to the same area. For years, there were trucks that were hauling logs out of that area. Then, among many people who signed this new bill that put a lot of the lands of the United States off limits to you and I, and also started putting land off limits to loggers, was signed by Dianne Feinstein out of San Francisco, who was a senator. Well, we saw our lumber industry go downhill in the western United States. The lumber industry used to maintain the forests, used to maintain the roads. They lived in the forest. They knew about the forest. They took care of the forests. We don't have anybody taking care of the forest anymore. Up in this neck of the woods, up in the northern part of Idaho, back in something like 1909, there was something called the Big Burn. Started over, I think, in Washington, burned over through northern Idaho, went into Montana, burned up millions of acres. And why? Because over the years, trees had died, small fires had taken place, and there was a lot of undergrowth that was ready to combust. Because of what has happened in the last, say, 50 plus years, where we no longer have people in the forest taking care of it, that same situation exists today.
And, I mean, look no further than what has happened to, the coastal state in recent years with fire.
California, Oregon, and Washington. California lost an entire city.
Yeah. I'm actually, believe it or not, not related to this conversation, but I was just talking with a federal forestry guy. I've also had Dustin Miller, director of lands, in here. I had the GM of Bogus Basin. They're working with Bureau of Land Management. All these different people have really got their heads together saying, hey, what do we need to do to preserve this? What do we need to do to work with industry? How can we benefit? Because obviously, trees are valuable. Not all lodgepole stands are valuable or have significant market value, but essentially, how can we preserve and manage this? Quite unfortunately, everyone that I've spoken with has said, man, August 2025, get the marshmallows ready because we are going to have huge fires. It's been a slightly drier year than was anticipated. It's going to be intense. Anyway, different conversation.
Not necessarily, because it's about energy. Because those wood products give us energy. And we use energy to get those food products into a useful product, clear the land, replant the land, and reuse it. So we've had more and more forest fires in California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, etc. over the past few years. They're increasing. We were known as a nation, and I can't put a date on this, but we were known as a nation forever that was the nation that led the world in forest management. We planted more board feet than we harvested. We put more fish into the streams than we harvested. We had more animals that we had because of our good animal practices. I'll give you one which really is great, and it's the North Slope of Alaska. When the North Slope of Alaska was being opened up, one of the anti-everybody groups said, you're going to kill all the caribou up there. There were 3,000 some caribou up there in 1969-70 timeframe. Well, guess what? The oil companies hire people that are real conservancy people, that are real outdoors people, that really understand what goes on, and they studied the life of the caribou. What they found was that over time, that the number of trees that were available for caribou to scratch their backs had decreased. As a result, the caribou were getting various parasites on their backs and were killing them. So what the oil company did was they welded a piece of steel that was scalloped on the bottom of the pipelines where they were supported. The caribou then could go scratch their backs. And because there's short caribou, younger ones, and there's taller caribou, they put at them at some different elevations. Now, that was sometime in the early 70s. I was up there, I think, in 1990 or 1991. And I was up there because I was looking for a good environmental success project. And they actually flew me up to the North Slope. It was when ARCO had it. Well, the caribou population, instead of being decimated, was now up to 17,000. Simply for one thing. The oil companies provided the ability for the caribous to scratch their back.
That's wild. Richard, I don't know. You've been all over the world, man. It's a good thing we're doing these every week.
But it's all energy related.
Yeah.
It's all energy related. Energy is the biggest business in the world. It's twice as big as the next business from a standpoint of revenue. Next biggest part of business revenue-wise is insurance. But energy is twice as big as it. So going back to our fuel cycle.
Yes, I was going to say.
In the middle of the fuel cycle, we have the reactor. So we won't talk about the reactor. The reactor just takes the uranium, consumes about 3% to 4% of the chemical heat value, and then it's removed and it's put in a pool for storage for some period of time.
Could I be horribly rude? I
Sure.
gotta go to the bathroom so bad. I slugged a bunch of what? Let me go to the bath. Hang on, everybody. Okay, back end of the fuel cycle.
So we refuel a reactor. We then put the partially spent fuel in a fuel pool to radiologically let it cool. What that means is it's still fissioning. And the rate of fission decays off slowly. It's not producing a lot of heat, but it's still producing some heat. So we want to put it in a fuel pool to allow it to cool radiologically. So people will give you all kinds of numbers, but you need to leave it in there for 2.5 years or so.
And when you say pool, like
It's a pool of water.
I saw this at INL. That's that. Well, I won't say exactly, but like you stare down, there's a catwalk and you can stare down and you can see like the purple corona coming off of it.
Oh, you did? Oh, good. Cool.
With
That's
my
cool.
own 2 eyes, baby.
Yeah, that's cool.
They didn't let me take a picture, but that's what you're talking about, which is, look, your useful life for our purposes are, you're not producing enough heat. So you're spent. We're going to take you over here and you just hang out for a couple of years.
That's right. So you can compute it based upon what the fuel is. And you can say, okay, it needs to be there for 2.24 years or 2.7 years or whatever, but it's over 2 years. So the theory was, back in the 1950s, was the fuel would come out of reactors, it would go into a fuel pool, and from the fuel pool, at the time, the Atomic Energy Commission, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, later on the DOE, would take custody of the fuel to either store it or do some sort of final disposal or to recycle it. So politics and the emotions of people mostly impacted by the anti-nuclear industry changed all that over the years. So since the first plant went in operation Shippingport in 1958 to today, the federal government has failed to provide a way to deal with the fuel on the back end of the fuel cycle. So you're now talking about, 70 plus years. The federal government has failed in its responsibility that it took on by law.
And when you have the spent fuel, there has been discussion that like we could just recycle this and make it into new viable fuel.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
So let's go back to the fuel pool. The fuel pools are designed, depending on the reactor, they're designed to hold 2 or 3 or 4 loads of fuel.
Okay.
And then the intent was that the Department of Energy would come up with a way to take it from there to either permanently store it or temporarily store it or put it into something that would be forever storage. The reality is it has value. People like to call it a waste. It's an asset. We've got about 90,000 metric tons of it now stored around the country between the fuel pools and dry casks. So along the way, since the federal government was not doing its job, the Congress passed the 1982 National Waste Policy Act and said the Department of Energy, you will have this program. And prior to that, the big failure was, under the Carter administration, the Department of Energy set out to find a place to put this fuel. Not necessarily put it in the ground forever, but a place to put it. So they had a $4.1 billion budget during the Carter administration for people to go out and find a place to put the fuel. We all knew where that should be. It should be in Nevada and Yucca Mountain. There was no place else. We all knew that. But no, under the Carter administration, they set out, they spent $4.1 billion to go around the country and look for places. I was on active duty, so I had to be careful in the Navy, so I had to be careful what I said. But I actually talked to the guy in charge of that program at the Department of Energy. And I said, you know what you're doing is wrong. He said, yeah, but I got $4.1 billion and I'm going to spend it. So a couple of the things that came up, there's a woman in Connecticut somewhere. She is literally hanging wash on her clotheslines to allow the sun to dry it. There's some people in the woods behind her house. She'd never seen anybody back there. She said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" "We're surveying for a nuclear waste dump." That doesn't go over very well with the public in some city or wherever she lived, in whatever town she lived in. There's some rancher out in, I think it's Deaf City or I think it's Deaf County, Texas. This rancher is wandering around his ranch and he sees these trucks in the middle of his ranch. So he goes up to him and he says, "What are you doing on my ranch?" "We're surveying for a nuclear waste dump." Now, those are two that I heard from people who were there. Think about how many times this occurred around the country. Using taxpayers' money, we help to alienate, this is another way to alienate the American public against nuclear power. It's always been, we've all known, it's Yucca Mountain. I was first in Yucca Mountain in 1977 when I was still on active duty. It just happened to be 10 years apart. 1977, 1987, 1997, and 2003 or something like that. It's always been Yucca Mountain. But here's why we're not using Yucca Mountain. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act said you got to find a place and you got to prepare it to store it forever or dispose of it forever. Then they talked about interim storage. So it's gone back and forth between interim storage and final storage. Well, you need both. You need interim storage until it's economically feasible to reprocess. Pardon me. Then you need final storage for whatever small amount is left after it's reprocessed and reused again. Well, in 2005, some senators who are anti-nuclear senators in the Congress forced the Bush administration into hiring their guy and put him in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Fast forward to about 2011. All of the work had been done at Yucca Mountain. Excuse me. All the work had been done at Yucca Mountain, and it was ready to receive fuel. That person that was in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which was already an anti-nuclear government agency, he then lied. The paperwork was ready for his signature. I can't tell you how many people in the NRC have told me that. He lied and said it wasn't ready. The president at the time, who was Obama, backed him up on it. So Yucca Mountain has not been opened. We still don't have a place. So between the ratepayers and taxpayers, we're still paying burdens that we've been paying since the late 1950s because the federal government would not do what it was supposed to do starting back in the 1950s. Excuse me.
Okay. I don't have a lot of input here. So we're accumulating all of this spent fuel.
90,000 metric tons approximately, and we're getting 2,000 new metric tons a year from our fleet of commercial nuclear power plants.
We don't have an effective place to store it, and there is a soft agreement in place that we will not recycle it because one of the byproducts of recycling it is plutonium, correct?
One of them, yes.
Okay. And so that is preventing us. So that problem is preventing us from storing it or recycling it. And again, specifically because plutonium is what you use for weapons.
It's not stopping us from storing it. It's stopping it from having a central repository to store it. What we're doing is we're storing it in cement casks that had to be developed to store it because there was no other alternative. Now, the cement casks are doing a good job. and we can store them for a long, long time. But right now, we have no way of adequately dealing with our spent fuel on the back end of the fuel cycle, except to store it in concrete casks around the country.
Okay. We have talked about quite a few things today, including the birth to, and the whole thing of fuel. Did you, and again, I don't want to rush you, but I know you definitely want to come in and talk about the actual process of fission today. Do we have anything else? I mean, because we've been going through a bunch. Do you want to?
We can stop right here.
No. I don't want to stop.
Oh.
What I'm saying is I'm trying to figure out if there's anything from the back end of the fuel cycle that you want to hit. Because we're essentially now this is how we mine it, we mill it, yellow cake, gas. Then we have 238 and 235 separated out. We enrich to 20% for fuel, 94% for, nuclear submarine engines that either increase the duration or decrease the volume of it that we need. All of these different things, once it is used, cement cast, because we don't have a federally designated and funded centralized storage. We also have a soft agreement, which we didn't touch on. We can hit it in a later episode, but we have a soft agreement to not recycle it because the recycling process kicks out plutonium, which is a weapons grade element. Isotope.
But we do know how to manage it.
Right.
So managing it is not the problem is not managing it.
Managing the.
So we have to look at, in reality, the economics of it. If I can buy,
when you say manage it, what's the it?
We can manage the fuel that comes out of a reactor, the partially spent fuel, and we can convert it into reusable fuel, and we can store the bad isotopes that come out of it.
Sure, of course.
We can do that.
Of course, that can absolutely be done.
We've proved that since World War II. We do a really good job at managing this highly radioactive material. We do a great job. And we got thousands of people that are dedicated to doing it. But the bottom line is, from an economic standpoint, the majority of the use is by our commercial fleet of reactors. It's cheaper for them to buy new uranium than it is for them to buy reprocessed uranium. I don't know.
So another area where we're not developing our own infrastructure to make uranium independence.
That's right. I would venture to say it hasn't changed much, but it used to be that if we reprocess at 90,000 metric tons, then the cost of that available fuel to the commercial fleet of reactors is going to be 4 to 5 times more than it has been able to buy enriched fuel from Kazakhstan or Russia. And as a country, we are way behind at being able to provide our own. So it's an asset that's waiting to be used, but from an economic standpoint, we're not ready to do it.
Gotcha. Do you want to hit fission now?
I just quickly want to hit fission so that you have an idea what fission is and how simple it is.
And by the way, you've done a great job explaining the whole fuel cycle. So awesome. And this all starts with the capacity, the fission capacity. None of this happens without fission.
And fission is something, again, going back to the experiment that was done under those bleachers in the University of Chicago in 1941. They knew that it would happen already because they'd seen the results of it. What they were concerned about was, can we control it and can we remove the heat from it? So they had all kinds of, they designed a pile, they called it a pile, to be able to remove the heat and also control the fission, which they successfully did. And that became the age of us using fission for fission reactors. And what happens in the fission process is very simple. We have the fuel loaded into a reactor, and then we have something called control rods. And the control rods are down in the middle of all of that fuel. And the control rods are made of materials that suck up neutrons. In other words, the materials themselves naturally absorb neutrons and don't allow them to travel any further. So we have a shutdown condition. So what happens is, to start up a reactor, we simply start pulling those rods up until our nuclear instrumentation tells us that we have a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. And that's where we stop, because it's self-sustaining. And all it means is we have controlled the reactivity addition to the point that we have neutrons that are traveling around, and they hit a uranium-235 atom, and it splits. And the uranium-235 atom then creates an average of 2.54 other neutrons, while at the same time creating what we call a bunch of daughter products or fission product gases, which I'm not going to go into detail on that now. Sure. But that becomes this self-sustaining reaction. And we've learned how to do that so well over the years. EBR-1, 1951, the Navy reactor, 1953. The most successful program we have came about because of the Naval Reactor Program. And the choice was made for the Navy to use pressurized water reactors, because they could design and build them using highly enriched fuel to be smaller and put out a lot of power for a long period of time. So what you've got a bunch of Navy people out here in the commercial industry, which even today, there's a resentment by the non-Navy people in a bunch of these reactors, because the Navy people know so much.
Well, leave it to the U.S. military. Okay, so if I may take a crack at this and explain it, because again, I heard your explanation. I probably heard it like 3 or 4 times, but it wasn't until I really talked to you and then, dove into a bit of research myself. I'm like, okay, hang on. I kind of got this. Okay. So imagine the pellets, right? We got pellets in these, like long pencil type. Scratch all that. You just have a cylinder with charcoal briquettes. Okay, that's your fuel. You literally just have these, and you got a bunch of these cylinders, right? And they're spaced out just right. And in between, like if you just light them all on fire, they'll just light and burn out, and that's it. And maybe it produces too much heat, because you're trying to cook burgers, and you're like, look, my cylinders are. So what you do is you drop things in between them so that the charcoal briquettes are separated, so that the heat coming from this cylinder of charcoal briquettes does not touch the heat coming from the other one, and they don't interact, so they don't, like the charcoal needs to be close to each other.
It's a
right?
good analogy.
Cool. And so what you do is you have these essentially shields that are just things that absorb the heat, whatever, and you raise them up out of the way, or you drop them down and put them in the way. Right. My mom, when I was learning how to barbecue when I was in middle school, we had a Weber kettle, and my mom, was trying to show me how, you get oxygen from the bottom grates, you expel the gases from the top grates. And she's like, when you're all done, you close these gaps. And I'm like, wait, why are you closing them? She's like, it's going to stop the reaction. It's going to stop the heat. It's like, well, why do we want to do that? She's like, well, first off, you don't want to waste the fuel. And second, you just you don't need it to be cooking anymore. So you choke it off, right? So you just remove the things. That's effectively the exact same thing. If you want to stop the nuclear reactor, you drop the control rods down, which blocks off the interaction between the fuel rods, which are, your charcoal briquettes, but they're actually uranium, right? That stops that reaction.
Same thing.
And if you want it to burn hotter, create more heat energy and more electricity through the turbine, you raise the blockers away so all of the rods can interact with each other. And that, quote, interaction is actually neutrons being created by a neutron colliding with one of the uranium pellets. That uranium pellets produces, instead of just one neutron going in and one neutron going out, that takes one neutron in and then produces, on average, 2.54 neutrons coming out, right? So now we have kind of an exponential growth of heat and neutrons, because okay, 2.54 there, those shoot over to the other guy, and then it's, 2.54 times 2.54, which is, I don't know, 6.25 something, like whatever.
Let's take a step backwards.
Yeah, great.
Your analogy with something in between the briquettes is right. What your mother taught you in closing the upper and lower vents, all you're doing is removing the oxygen, the air. So you're doing exactly the same thing with the rods in a reactor. If you want to shut it down, if you want to start it up, you open them up until you have enough reactivity so it's sustaining.
And when you say open that up, that means take the control rods out of the way
and pull them up.
That's analogous to opening the oxygen vents on the Weber kettle.
That's correct.
There you go.
Or if you want to shut it down, you just shut them down.
Closing the vents on the Weber kettle.
Closing the vents on the Weber. Same thing.
Got it.
It's really that simple.
And that's the nature of this, which is we just have a charcoal briquette. It's just uranium. And instead of oxygen, it needs to interact with other uranium.
That's right.
And instead of sucking in oxygen and running a carbon cycle, they're having a fission reaction where you're just kicking out more neutrons than you're taking in. And aside from the neutrons, you're getting heat energy. So it's like, okay, great. Well, let's take more neutrons. Let's get more heat energy. And that's how we run the whole cycle.
That's it.
There we go.
That's
Bringing it back to the Weber kettle.
Sorry. That's it.
Good.
So,
and this is used, to be really clear, this is used with let's say light water reactors. We have fuel rods and we also have control rods, and that interaction, exposure or not exposure, drives the cycle.
The fuel is fixed.
Yes, excuse me. Okay, the control rods go up and down.
Yeah,
right.
And then those rods have a material in the rods that is by nature just stops a neutron from traveling any further. That's all it does.
Right.
And
so you don't get that 2.54 multiplier.
That's right. It just it starts the amount of reactivity is controlled by the position of the fuel rods with this material that sucks up neutrons. When you want to shut it down, the rods are down at the bottom.
Got it. And this is distinct. We're not getting into this today, though. This is distinct from a molten salt reactor where the salt is infused with the fuel.
They're mixed together.
They're mixed, and there are not control rods in this per se to control.
They're not control rods as you think of control rods in light water reactors, be it a boiling water reactor or a light water reactor. But there still is a material that is down there that helps to control the reactivity so that you reduce the amount of neutrons that are available for fission. And we'll get into that in a later subject.
Yeah. It's because every time we're like, but this is advancing technology. And then we have, but again, for our purposes, and especially for the reactors that are very common, you have fuel rods, you have control rods. All you got to do to increase or decrease the heat and the reaction is drop or raise the control rods. And that just chokes out the oxygen or gives the Weber kettle more oxygen.
And the way that it's done in the molten salt nuclear battery from micronuclear is a trick. And it was simply Dr. Paul Murata and Dr. Richard Christensen that came up with a way, starting with the basis of looking at the molten salt reactor experiments at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the 1960s. And they said, okay, how can we control the reactivity and not have it interfere with the flow of the molten salt? The molten salt being the molten salt that also had uranium in it. And they came up with a very clever way of doing it, which we're at least not going to discuss today.
Not today. Is there anything else you want to hit on this fuel cycle?
No, I think this is this gives us the basis for talking about a lot more.
Great. Perfect. Thank you for coming in. We're going to do it again next week, yeah?
My pleasure.
God bless it. Thank you, sir.